Good morning, everyone. Let's start this second panel of the morning. I'm the host, so I'm going to be very brief. I'm just going to share with you two things that have been on my mind lately. One is that I'm sure that most of us, at least many of us who are sitting here and who pay attention to these issues of NATO, have probably spent the last couple of days, and particularly yesterday, looking at the news, watching the news, and waiting for novelties, what was going to happen. I think there wasn't a time that I can recall that we did this about NATO. I mean, so what's going on? What's happening tomorrow in this sense? And, well, I would add that most of us are really happy that Finland and Sweden will be joining NATO, are invited to join NATO. And just to remind you of two things. One, apparently, long gone seem to be the days when NATO was supposedly brain dead, or NATO allies were foes rather than friends. So that's something that we have on our mind. It seems that it was ages ago. The other thing, and I think it's important particularly for us in Europe, is to remember that Sweden and Finland joined the European Union after the end of the fall of the Berlin Wall. Were actually the first new member states after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And contrarily to what happened with the falling new member states, they didn't join the EU they didn't join NATO, just like Austria. And there was a reason for that we all understand why. They wanted to show that they finally could show that they were on the western side of the discussion. They were free to join the EU. But they didn't want NATO because they thought that could be more risky than the guarantees that it came along. Well, they've changed their mind, and I think this tells a lot about what's going on. But, I mean, these were my 2 minutes. Brigitte Wagner from the Heritage Foundation, and who comes to the Sturil Political Forum, knows very well, is not only the chair of this meeting, but has the privilege, I would say, to introduce the speakers. So you're even more lucky because you have the 3 speakers to introduce, but I'm very lucky to introduce you, Brigitte. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Enrique, yes. And let me add my thanks to Professor Espada and Rita Seabra-Brita for arranging again such a fabulous gathering with such insightful speakers and the wonderful students who we are each year, I think, inspired by. It was a great pleasure to be able to listen to the debate in this last session. So look forward to the students joining us. As Enrique said, yesterday we received the news that Turkey agreed to support the NATO membership of Finland and Sweden, and today the NATO summit begins in Madrid. Since its moves into Georgia in 2008 and Ukrainian Crimea and Donbass in 2014, Russia has been publicly challenging the West. This year's brutal attack on Ukraine has been one of NATO's biggest challenges on continental Europe. Economic sanctions on Russia and heavy weapons and relief to Ukraine have brought the Western nations together in a show of force, but is it enough? As one Baltic leader wrote in the Washington Post recently, the time has come to understand that Russia cannot be stopped by persuasion, cooperation, appeasement, or concessions. We must show decisiveness and determination, and the Madrid summit will be the chance to do so. The summit will literally shape the future of NATO, and that is our topic this morning, the future of NATO. This morning, we'll hear from 4 distinguished speakers who will address this challenging topic. Gary Schmidt of the American Enterprise Institute, whose career includes service as Executive Director of the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board and Minority Staff Director for the Senate's Select Committee on Intelligence in the United States Congress. He's authored and edited numerous books, the most recent on national security, particularly relevant to today's discussion, is titled A Hard Look at Hard Power, Assessing the Defense Capabilities of Key U.S. Allies and Security Partners. Mike Gonzalez of the Heritage Foundation, whose career includes 20 years as a journalist in Europe, Asia, and Latin America for the Wall Street Journal and AFP, and service in the administration of President George W. Bush, including in the State Department's European Bureau. Professor Livia Franco of the IEP, who serves as associate researcher at the European Council on Foreign Relations in addition to her duties at Catholic University and is herself a frequent and is, in addition, a frequent media commentator on European and international affairs. And Professor Miguel Monjardino of the Institute for Political Studies, who also serves as the foreign affairs columnist of the newspaper Expresso and a political military analyst with the Portuguese cable news channel. So let's start off with Gary Schmidt.
Thanks, Bridget. I was just telling Bridget and Mike that this is probably the first time I'm to the right of heritage. The panel's topic, the future of NATO, is a perennial topic. It's certainly one that's been the case at least since I moved to Washington 40 years ago. And I have no doubt that it was often a topic of discussion in the decades prior. The fact that it seems to be a perennial issue has two sides to it. The first side is that there always seems to be uncertainty about the alliance's way forward and whether it will succeed in meeting its stated goals. At the same time, the very fact that the question about NATO's future is still being asked suggests a certain permanence to the alliance's perceived relevance that reinforces the quip that if NATO didn't exist, something like it would have to be invented. I think this tension between regularly questioning NATO's future, but also its seeming necessity, is as true today as it has been in the past and likely will be so in the future. To start, obviously NATO is more relevant today than any time since the end of the Cold War. It's hardly obsolete, as the former U.S. president once put it. But I would like to argue that the alliance has always maintained its relevance through previous major changes in the global security environment, be it the early years in the Cold War, second half of the Cold War when there was nuclear parity between the Soviet Union and the U.S., the aftermath of the Cold War when it was said about NATO out of area or out of business, and now in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Looking back, one sees the alliance having made significant structural and operational changes in light of the changes in the security environment. Moreover, many of the operational changes that were made came at the request of the United States, changes our allies consistently consented to. In that regard, not only has NATO maintained its relevance, but arguably the record shows that the alliance's ability to shift gears, as it has done over the years, suggests that the French president's declaration of a few years ago that NATO was brain dead was certainly premature. To be clear, this is not to say the alliance acts as rapidly as we in Washington would like, nor that the allies fully fulfill their alliance commitments. Indeed, the failure of most of the allies to reach the 2% mark of defense spending relative to their GDP is a constant reminder of that fact. And indeed, the public perception of NATO is more often defined by these shortcomings than what the alliance does provide. Lost in the discussion of the shortcomings is the actual increased hard power that allies do provide and have provided in every major conflict that the U.S. has been involved in since World War II. Contributions that are largely made possible by the working relationships that have become institutionalized precisely because of NATO. These habits of working together are too easily overlooked. Moreover, to cut to the chase, does anyone think that Europe's response to the invasion of Ukraine, as uneven as it has been, would have been possible or substantial had it been in the absence of NATO's Article 5 security guarantees? To put all this in terms of that the NATO Secretary General would probably not like, the alliance is not and never will be a thoroughbred racehorse. Rather, it's more like a mule, often slow to move, often stubborn in its ways, but given a persistent push and with a lead hand, it's capable of carrying a considerable security burden for its members. To carry this point further, after Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2014, the alliance has not been sitting on its hands, nor has it reacted as substantially as it should have. On the one hand, it created new operational and logistic commands, created new centers focused on cyber and hybrid warfare, and it moved forces and rotated forces into the Baltic states, Poland, and Southeast Europe. Alliance-wide, defense spending has increased for 7 straight years, totaling over 200 billion euros in new monies. Just as significant, 21 allies now spend at least 20% of their defense budget on procuring weapons and supplies, a huge jump from just a few years before. That said, as the NATO summit in Madrid has made clear by what it is proposing for the alliance going forward, this previous progress falls short of what was needed. Indeed, the fact that it's been more than a decade since the last strategic concept was issued, even though there has been a clear change in that security environment since then, reflects a lack of leadership on the part of the major powers within the alliance, but especially from Washington, which has had 2 successive presidents who are clearly less interested in transatlantic affairs. The decision to issue a new strategic document and increase the alliance's rapid reaction force from 40,000 to 300,000 are obviously positive signs as well as necessary ones. It's easy to dismiss the issuance of a new strategic document as being a paper exercise, but getting consensus among all 30 member states on what the alliance's priorities are is no small thing, and it allows NATO to do planning in a more efficient and focused way. Nevertheless, other gaps will need to be filled, and these include logistics, capabilities, electronic warfare upgrades, added air defenses, and a vast increase in ammunition stocks. Bottom line, everyone will need to spend more. This will be especially true in Europe. While the U.S. military is still the world's preeminent military, it is no longer the dominant military that it has been in the past. For the past decade, the Pentagon has publicly admitted that it can no longer deal with 2 major conflicts at the same time. That means, in turn, that the conventional deterrent posture can only really be effective in one end or the other of the Eurasian landmass. And since 2012, U.S. administrations have made it clear that they want to put most of their military eggs in the Indo-Pacific basket. This doesn't mean that the U.S. will not contribute more to European security, but it will not be as massive as it might have been in the past. And any real increase in deterrence will have to come from NATO allies. In that regard, it's no small thing that Sweden and Finland will become member states. There are serious militaries whose geographic location enhances security in the Baltic Sea and complicates Russian military planning in the high north. Also of importance is Germany's decision to add 100 billion euros to its defense budget over the next few years. And that is in addition to the 33% increase since 2014. As Europe's largest economic power, it's important that Germany has made this decision in moving forward. No doubt, we will have to see whether this so-called turning point in German strategic thinking is sustained. 2 points here. First, the 100 billion is being dispensed under a special budget dispensation. There's been little said about what follows when that money has been spent. And that 100 billion will go quickly once they start buying F-35s and just fix the readiness problems the German military faces now. But second, a truly transformational change will require an equally significant shift in German political culture regarding military matters. In 2014, German elites spoke of the need for their country to step up and play a larger role in maintaining the international order, an order which they admitted Germany had greatly benefited from. But Chancellor Merkel's lack of leadership in this area resulted in the so-called Munich consensus dying largely on the vine. Now, while NATO's to-do list is substantial, none of the problems facing NATO are insurmountable. Nor are the problems any greater or any less serious than past challenges. That said, Washington will need to interact with NATO much more directly moving forward. And while the Biden administration came into office saying that it wanted to reinvigorate transatlantic ties, between the unilateral and precipitous decision to pull out of Afghanistan and the problems on the U.S. domestic front, the White House team has seemed reluctant to have the president take on a more public leadership role, for example, with respect to the war in Ukraine, perhaps worried that the public will see this as an unnecessary diversion from troubles on the home front. I actually don't think that would be the case. Presidents typically gain in the polls by showing leadership in times of crisis, as long as they are successful in meeting that crisis. In any case, as I suggested earlier, as mule-like, NATO will not succeed in meeting its new objectives in the absence of presidential leadership. Given the uncertain signals sent about the alliance by the two previous administrations, that leadership is more important than ever. Thank you.
And thank you, Gary. Over to you, Mike.
So I want to note that Gary was exactly at 10 minutes, and I'll try to do exactly the same thing. It's been a long 3 days. I want to challenge the old adage that everything has been said, but not everybody has said it. I want to join Enrique and Bridget and everyone else in being overjoyed that Turkey gave in and Finland and Sweden are in. This talk is in the future of NATO. And I think I also want to join everybody in the understanding that Russian imperialism at the other end of Europe has driven home more than ever the importance of NATO and what we need to have a future and stick together collectively. Putin could overestimate again. He could create havoc in the Baltics. But I think we can draw some conclusions. Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova have been invaded, harassed constantly, because they're outside of NATO, while Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia had not been occupied so far because they're inside NATO. So I think the lesson, at least for me, is simple. NATO enlargement did not cause Putin to launch his genocidal war. It was the opposite. Hesitation is provocative. Weakness and indecisiveness invite conflict. When we speak about the future of NATO, we must think of three things for the foreseeable future. Number one, reinforce its capabilities. Number two, and that, by the way, that's being done, I'm very happy to note. Number two, take in new members who has to join. The new ones, Sweden and Finland, should be done. Just shorten the paperwork. And then reinforce our presence in East Europe member states. The summit in Madrid getting underway, NATO will have the opportunity to achieve these goals. But if it just simply repackages itself in the old ideas that it has had, Russia is going to look at that as a weakness again. As I said, weakness is provocative. From my perspective, a stable, secure Europe is firmly in the national interest of the United States, and this begins with NATO and its capability of deterring further Russian aggression. So let's start with capabilities. For years, NATO and U.S. allies failed to live up to their Article 3 commitment. This is why in 2006, NATO set a target for member states to expand to 2% of GDP on defense. Now, defense spending has been steadily rising since Russia's first invasion of Ukraine, and now with the second invasion, it's going even faster. I think that's a very good thing, positive trend, but I think that our allies should do more to make domestically the case for defense spending. Number two, we have to move very fast with Finland and Sweden. This inclusion will bolster transatlantic security by adding two countries that have capabilities and willingness to contribute. The militaries of these two countries, Finland's war in 1940 has already been mentioned, and the courage they showed. These two countries bring quite a lot of capacity to the alliance. Finnish and Swedish membership will also be great in securing critical regions such as the Arctic, the Baltic, the Nordic regions through updated operational planning and negating any perceived strategic ambiguity. And I also want to add that they have a proven record of standing up to China. Which brings us to number three. We should establish a persistent and continuing presence in Eastern European member states. Since Russia's second invasion of Ukraine, the U.S. has bolstered its troop levels in Europe, almost exclusively, however, through the rotational forces. It is important to note that new rotational forces in Europe do improve deterrence, but they're an unequal substitute for permanently stationed forces, which have better person-to-person contact with allies, improved doctrinal, technical, and cultural interoperability. So acting in these three areas will do a lot to discourage further Russian aggression. But here's where my remarks, I think, will depart from a lot of what has been said. I think for NATO to have a future, a majority of all of us on both sides of the Atlantic must continue to believe that we're a community of values, not just a community of interests. And for that, we need to understand each other very well. We need to understand our domestic debates. And let me tell you why I say this. Late last week, I and other of my conservative friends who are supporters of the Transatlantic Alliance and who want to make sure that Putin is defeated began to worry, emailing back and forth, when all of a sudden, suddenly from Europe and from European leaders, we had a lot of statements on the Dobbs decision by the Supreme Court, which, as all of you know, well, most of you perhaps, overturned Roe versus Wade. I want to explain to you, to take the remaining 5 minutes, things that are happening in conservatism across the Atlantic that I fear are getting lost in translation. What is happening is not often understood by progressives in my own country, and if they arrive here through the prism of a press that I think all too often is controlled by progressives, and I would say I was a journalist for 20 years, I've been in many newsrooms, for better or for worse, if I didn't have liberal journalist friends, I wouldn't have any friends. So I'm talking about my friends. The nature of the debate in America is changing because many conservatives now, in my opinion, have finally understood that the battlefield that we're fighting is cultural. We're fighting figuring out how to win some of these consequential cultural battles. And this will not change no matter what happens to Donald Trump. Donald Trump has been a subtext of a lot of this conference, but though his name has not been pronounced a lot. He's kind of like Voldemort. Even if he's indicted, even if he loses support in the Republican Party, does not get nominated, or none of the above, what is happening among conservatives will not change. I hate to tell you, but the noise is not going to abate. The noise on my side of the Atlantic is going to get higher. A growing number of conservatives in the U.S., and I want you to understand this, do see an authoritarianism that needs to be confronted. Only we see it as an authoritarianism coming from progressives on issues of sex, on issues of race. It's happening in many important areas of life. It's happening in the classroom. It's happening in houses of worship. It's happening in the military barracks. It's happening in sports leagues, which we need an escape, or we're not getting an escape. And conservatives have decided to fight back and begin to win important battles at the state level. And I traveled the U.S. extensively. Last year, I visited 30 cities. I testified in state legislatures. And obviously, we won at the Supreme Court, but Dobbs is just one of many. There were many victories at the Supreme Court. And now, you have to understand that even Ruth Bader Ginsburg thought that Roe was very expansive. And the European abortion policies in many states are more restrictive than they are in the United States. Why am I talking? Why am I airing dirty laundry in front of you? Because I would be remiss. I would not be doing my job if I didn't tell you that within this new emboldened conservatism, of which I'm a part, there is a strand that believes that our problems at home, our challenges at home are so important that we need to turn inward. We need to look at only our domestic debates. I obviously disagree with that. My heritage colleagues are very clear-eyed about the international threats that we face. And as I say that, my boss just walked in, so Jim Carafano. So I want you to understand this perspective, especially since the social and cultural debate taking place in Europe as well. I'm going to be traveling to Spain tomorrow and Friday and be meeting with politicians who share this approach to cultural battles. Again, to finish off, this is not the beginning. This is not the end. This is just the beginning. The noise is going to get louder. We need to understand each other very well. I know it's rich for an American to say that when Americans really do not understand the Portuguese domestic debate, but at least I try. Kathleen Marshall had a very good speech yesterday, I believe, in which she talked about deference in political debate. This means at least understanding that to many of us, it simply wasn't true that a right was taken away last week. We just don't believe that that right ever existed in the Constitution, let alone natural law. This is a political debate that it is now returning to the people where it belongs. That's our view. Look, an average of 71% of publics across NATO believe that their country should defend another NATO ally if attacked. Some of you may think, oh, fantastic, 71%. I worry about that almost third that does not believe that. I do not want that third to get bigger. I do believe that, especially with people like Putin around and Xi Jinping, we need to stick together. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you, Michael. Thanks for giving that perspective from America. Livia?
Yeah. Okay, so good morning. It's a pleasure to be here again. I thank the organizers, Professor Espada, Rita, for inviting me. I'm also delighted to be here at this panel with these fellow panelists. Some of us, I think, are veterans on this panel. I'm thinking about Bridget and myself, Miguel and Enrique also. Some new faces, which is always good. This panel has been invited to say a few words on the future of NATO in the context of rising authoritarianism. It turns out that unlike in the past 5-6 years, speaking about NATO and especially its future seems to have become a much easier task since the past February 24. The reason is very simple, that someday, we all know, Russia brutally and illegally invaded Ukraine, thus shattering the European security architecture in place since 1991. Indeed, over the past 4 months, facts have been speaking for themselves, dispensing with many words, and the transatlantic alliance, with 2 new aspiring members, looks set to stay for a lot of years to come. And yet, I think this is only a superficial and essentially political reading of NATO's seemingly secure future. Rather, it is my opinion that a more in-depth and strategic view on NATO would highlight at least 3 key challenges whose implications are far from taking for granted that very future. These are, 1, the return of interstate threats and great power competition. 2, the continuing shift in global power from the Euro-Atlantic area to the Indo-Pacific. And 3, the need to guarantee within the alliance a strong link between democratic governance and security gains. My remarks on the future of NATO will be short and organized around precisely these 3 points. The first point, the return of great power competition. Events in the past years confirmed, and this year, at the beginning of this year, confirmed that not only the return of interstate threats and great power competition to Europe, but necessarily came to question the alliance's post-Cold War focus on transnational challenges and non-peer competition. Precisely because of this, NATO's new strategic concept, to be approved today or tomorrow in Madrid, will have to contemplate a better balance between the alliance's so-called 3 core tasks: collective defense, crisis management, and cooperative security, that were established 12 years ago in Lisbon. In the current context of war in Europe, it is clear that collective defense, Article 5, must once again take priority over the other 2 tasks. We should, therefore, not be surprised that discussions on how to continue to assist Ukraine and bolster deterrence along the eastern part of the alliance will continue to take center stage, not only in Madrid, but on NATO's agenda for the foreseeable future. I insist on this because many of those who are here today, I'm thinking about our students, were born after the end of the Cold War and are used to hearing about NATO mostly in relation to Kosovo, Afghanistan, or Libya. This is understandable, but deterring a war in Europe is what NATO was created for in the first place. On April 4, 1949, while addressing the crowd of politicians and military at the signing ceremony of the founding treaty of NATO, the then US President, Harry Truman, made the following remarks. The purpose of this meeting is to take the first step toward putting into effect an international agreement to safeguard the peace and prosperity of this community of nations. This treaty is a simple document, he said. And then, a little further on his speech, he then insisted, this is a simple document that if it had existed in 1914 and 1939, I believe it would have prevented the acts of aggression which led to 2 world wars, quote unquote. NATO is now 73 years old, yet Truman's words still hold true. The alliance's primary goal continues to be to prevent acts of aggression against its member countries. Obviously, the world has changed profoundly and threats have taken a different form, but NATO's fundamental relevance remain, I think, unquestioned. This is easily confirmed by comparing the following statements pronounced more than 7 decades apart by, respectively, NATO's first and NATO's current Secretary Generals. At the beginning of the 1950s, in a famous quote so often repeated, Lord Ismay said that the purpose of NATO was to keep the Soviet Union out, the Americans in, and the Germans down. Just a few weeks ago, while in Berlin, Jens Stoltenberg, the current Secretary General, observed that NATO now, quote unquote, faces a President Putin who wants Ukraine defeated, NATO down, and Europe and North America divided. Apart from the use of a very similar epigraphic style, what connects these two statements? The answer, I think, is they both highlight in a very, very pragmatic way NATO's relevance in each historic context. Yes, the Cold War and the Soviet Union have long disappeared, but luckily NATO is still around and has been enlarged from 12 to 30 member countries and has now 2 new official aspiring members. And why is this so? Because the alliance remains absolutely relevant in enabling its member countries to respond to the evolving geopolitical and security challenges they face. Second point, shift to the Indo-Pacific. As the Indo-Pacific becomes the center of gravity of global economic growth, military competition, and technological innovation, dynamics emanating from that region are likely to have a growing impact on other regions, including, of course, the Euro-Atlantic. Thus, the security architecture of the Euro-Atlantic region is likely to be increasingly affected by these exogenous factors. Questions such as how much emphasis should NATO put on the more systemic challenge represented by China's assertive strategic rise are, of course, particularly relevant in light of the growing salience of hybrid forms of warfare and emerging disruptive technologies. To be sure, the Euro-Atlantic region must remain NATO's direct reference. So I'm not proposing that NATO becomes a global alliance. No, that's not what I'm trying to speak here. What I'm saying is that the future of the region and of NATO itself will likely become increasingly affected by these broader geostrategic dynamics. Thus, for example, transatlantic allies will have to think more systematically about the main communicating vessels between the Euro-Atlantic security and these broader dynamics, specifically those coming from the Indo-Pacific. 3 of these stand immediately. 1, America's need to prioritize between Europe and Asia, and what that may mean for NATO and its European pillar. Gary just said that Biden's administration is not very eager to wage 2 wars at the same time. So this is my first note. Second, the evolution of the Sino-Russian relationship. Is it going to evolve from partnership to alliance? I read the front page of today's FT, and one of the headlines was, US blacklist Chinese companies for allegedly supporting Russian army. So is this only a partnership, or is this becoming an alliance between China and Russia? And finally, the political and military coordination between NATO and its key partners in the Asia-Pacific area is fundamental. Japan, Australia, the Republic of Korea, and New Zealand. The broader point, however, is that whatever the United States and its European allies think they can do, ultimately they can only do it if they remain aligned. And this is my third and final point, internal challenges linking democracy and security. NATO is currently confronting the most rapid negative change in the global security environment since its creation. And because of that, we have to see that the context of globalization is not anymore marked by cooperative multilateralism, but rather, I think, unruly global competition between increasingly assertive authoritarianism powers and, of course, weakened liberal democracies. These are not good news. The general picture is quite bleak. Freedom House's 2022 report is very, very clear on this diagnosis, and I will quote very shortly from page 1 of that report. Quote, unquote, global freedom faces a dire threat. Around the world, the enemies of liberal democracy are accelerating their attacks. Authoritarian regimes have become more effective at co-opting or circumventing the norms and institutions meant to support basic liberties and at providing aid to others who wish to do the same. The global order is nearing a tipping point. This is Freedom House. And if democracy's defenders do not work together to help guarantee freedom for all people, the authoritarian model will prevail. Am I then proposing that NATO should transform itself to an alliance for democracy promotion? No. Rather, what I'm advocating is that NATO should be associated with democratic resilience. And this is all the more important in this negative changing environment because deficits in internal cohesion can rapidly become an external security threat. The recent past has shown us how inattention to shared principles and values may create societal vulnerabilities that authoritarian competitors can quickly exploit to destabilize individual allies or the alliance as a whole. The examples are numerous, from propaganda to disinformation campaigns, from financial and political support of illiberal parties to special bilateral relations. The usual authoritarian suspects will not hesitate to use every opportunity they can to divide transatlantic allies and weaken the alliance's unity. And I'm concluding. In other words, what I'm trying to claim is that to prevail in the present global competition, transatlantic allies need to unflinchingly show to the rest of the world that their system of governments can outperform China's and Russia's authoritarianism, and that they can thwart non-democratic and aggressive attempts to reshape the international order. Of course, in itself, this is a formidable task, especially because just as NATO faces a deteriorating external security environment, it is also confronting internal turbulence related with democratic principles being unequally upheld across the alliance. To sum up, I want to emphasize here that in addition to having impeccable operational capabilities and effective military deterrence, it is also crucial to guarantee within NATO a strong link between democratic governments and security gains. There are several governance requirements that member states need to meet and to protect in order for the alliance to work properly. We know, for example, that democratic governments have historically been better at establishing civilian control over the military and over the intelligence services, of guaranteeing transparency of arms procurements, of creating confidence-building measures, or of collectively responding to emerging crises. These are all democratic foundations that, together with Article 5, make NATO stronger. in face of the global weakening of democratic principles and values, it is time, I think, for NATO to confront this erosion, including among its members. Thank you very much.
Here you need.
Thank you. Thank you, Olivia. Miguel.
Thank you. I'm the last one standing before you on lunch, which is a very dangerous position. But I have to thank the organizing committee for putting a shield on my right. When Greek hoplites used to fight, the last guy on the right was in the most vulnerable position. He couldn't lean against anyone. So I thank the organizing committee for putting this shield right here. I will try to say everything that I need in 8 minutes, so we have time for conversation, and then we can move to lunch. My remit at the Institute for the past 20 years has been more or less to think about the unthinkable. And Homer, Thucydides, and a few other classical authors have been my guide and my companions, together with a few people who are here, with whom I've been talking for a very long time, so I'm very grateful for them. I will try to address 2 questions. The first question is, why did deterrence fail in Ukraine? Why was it not possible to persuade Mr. Putin not to attack Ukraine again? That's the first question. The second question is, what are the implications of the current strategic situation for NATO's future? Now, let me start with the first question. Why did deterrence fail? We know now that CIA's director, William Burns, landed in Moscow early in November, and according to the American press, he told loud and clear, crystal clear, to his counterpart, his Russian counterpart, that the US administration knew Russia was planning to invade Ukraine. He also warned Russia what the United States will do if that event took place. And in the following months, the United States and European states also warned publicly and privately Russia what they will do in case Russia invaded Ukraine again. So this is a classic attempt to deter Russia from a certain course of action. It also encapsulates a way of thinking about international politics based on finance and economics. The idea that it's possible through economic and financial coercion to dissuade certain political actors from following on what they are thinking, doing. Now, deterrence failed, and it's quite interesting to discuss why. And I think the younger generation of students who are here, probably in 15, 20 years' time, some historian, political scientists, journalists, will be able to start writing very good books about why did Mr. Putin act the way he did. But based on what I've listened here for the past 2 days, I think internal politics in Russia could go a long way to explain why did it happen. Internal legitimacy of the regime, failure to reform the country, perceptions of history and national myths, and Putin has been quite clear about this, his image of Russia. And above all, from my point of view, Russia's perception of its own identity. It's quite interesting for the Portuguese to speak about this because our national borders have been settled for centuries. And the way I see it, Mr. Putin, I think most Russians do not accept the 1991 international borders of Russia. So I do believe that Russia has an unsettled problem about its national identity, what country it is. And I think most of Russia's society sees the 1991 national borders as a national humiliation, something they want. In a way, they were expropriated from the future they thought they were entitled to. So it's very, very difficult to fight against that. My conclusion from this evaluation of the situation is I think we are in for a long haul. It's not possible to change this national perception by persuasion. It will take probably quite a long time, and I think we should brace ourselves for that. Moving on to the second point, implications for NATO future. We are moving from globalization, and where people speak about supply and demand, just-in-time management, that kind of thing, to strategy, power, coercion. This is a very different world, and it will be very unsettling for many of the people who are here. For those who have read ancient stuff, when we speak about competition between great powers, well, welcome to history. It's been going on for a very, very long time. And that's why I do believe that in an age where everyone talks about the importance of technology and science, and I will go into that shortly, I think history and literature are probably the most important disciplines now. And I do remember that George Kennan read a lot about Russian literature to try to understand the national psyche of Russia, a very different country from our own. So I think we have to do two things. The first thing is to support Ukraine to defend itself. Ukraine is, for those who have read the classics, Ukraine is pursuing a defensive strategy based on attrition. But to follow a defensive strategy based on attrition, you have to have two things. The first one is a high tolerance to civilian and military casualties. So it's a strategy based on sacrifice. This is very, very hard to accept, I would say, in Western Europe. I'm not sure how many European societies will be able to follow a defensive strategy based on military and civilian attrition. That takes a lot of political capital. But it's also forging a country on blood. Let's be honest about this. The second thing is that the rates of fire, I will not go into details now, it doesn't matter in a panel like this, but the rate of fire is so high in Ukraine that Ukraine is virtually dependent on foreign assistance in terms of armaments transfers. And if you look at distances, logistics are very, very demanding. From the Polish border to Donbass is 1,000 kilometers in a straight line. So the logistics, without going into details, are immense and extremely challenging. And that means that preserving the Ukrainian army is more important for the time being than territory. The key variable for Ukraine in the coming weeks is to preserve its army. That will probably mean it would have to retreat slowly, but I think it's inevitable. And one question for the future is, will Ukraine have the ability to go on the attack throughout the summer? And there are many instances in history where you can adapt and practice a defensive strategy, and then it becomes very difficult to make the transition to offense. So that's a big question mark for me, what will happen in the future, if we'll have the firepower, the national will, the logistics to go on the offensive. I don't know the answer to that question. And moving on to the end, because my time is finishing, we are going to listen a lot about the NATO new strategic concept, NATO agenda for 2030. But for me, as a military analyst based in history, what would really matter is, do you have credible combat power from now on? Are we able to operate in the so-called gray zone? And above all, and I think Gary Schmidt spoke about this, do we have the technological and industrial base to make this transition to a different strategic time? This will be, the defense ecosystem will be very, very important for the future. So this is something that we really have to think about. The implications based on what Gary Schmidt and Mike said about American expectations about us in Europe is that I think United States, irrespective of who is president until 2030, will expect us, Europeans, to contribute with 40 to 50% of NATO's minimal capability requirements. That's a big, big jump. Big, big jump. That means that short term, we'll have to think about the next winter. It might be a good time to start preparing for the next winter. And medium term, we have to start thinking about the new battle space beyond 2030. Is this going to be difficult? Yes, this is going to be difficult. But I don't buy the argument that's out there that democracies are inferior to autocracies in terms of strategy. That's not my reading of history. We do have problems, yes, we do, but so do autocracies, lots of them. And we have the resources. We do have the resources to do this. So I think we should mobilize them and deploy them. Thank you.
We've covered a lot of ground in these four speakers, and we have about 30 minutes. I will leave a little bit of time for each of the panelists to make a quick wrap-up comment. So let me go ahead and call on questions from the floor, and seeing the number of hands, I'll collect several at once. Yours was first. Let's collect 2 or 3, and if you could wait for the microphone. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
And if you could say if you're addressing the question to any particular panelist.
Yes. Okay, I think I'm addressing to everybody in this case. So we had a sigh of relief yesterday when we learned that Turkey will no longer block Finland's and Sweden's accession to NATO. That was wonderful news. But another problem is that we had been kept in suspense for quite a long time about that. So, and this is not the first time when Turkey's position is somewhat different from other members of the alliance. So I would like any of you who would take that up, comment on the scope of the problem related to Turkey, maybe also Hungary, provided Orban put in special relationship, to the unity of the alliance and the effectiveness of the alliance. Thanks.
Excellent question. Thank you. Unity of the alliance. Next question is over here just to the right. Or to the...
I just want to firstly say thank you very much for your input. It was very interesting. My name is Noah. I'm representing the Jagiellonian University in Krakow. And before my question, I want to preface very quickly with the fact that I'm half Polish, I live in Poland, and I want to let everyone know that NATO expansion, or that I believe NATO expansion is completely justified. It was not an attack on Russia, and as a Pole, I know that our decision to join NATO was based on history, about 500 years of it, and oppression from Russian imperialism. Nevertheless, besides the normal Russian imperialism, there seems to be an idea among the Russian political elite that Russia needs to continue to expand because of its insecurity, territorial insecurity, highlighted by Catherine the Great, as well as Alexander Dugин's call to take the Polish and Bessarabian gaps. Now, to finish my question, how do we as an alliance create a Russia or a world where that insecurity does not exist? Thank you.
Thank you. Question over here next. And we'll break after this question with the awesome hair right in the middle here.
Thank you. My name is Antonio, and my question was, seeing how the interests of the U.S. appear to show that militarily it's more focused on the East and on the threat that China could pose to itself, while Europe appears to be more and more focused on Russia and the threat that it could appear to itself, could we see perhaps, instead of the strengthening of NATO with the armament of Germany, perhaps its weakening? France already has a history of wishing for its own foreign policy, and we already see Germany that, with a strong army, perhaps could attempt to impose itself and to focus more on its regional issues instead of focusing on the world abroad. Do you believe that would happen, or do you believe that we are simply seeing NATO becoming stronger and stronger and stronger? Thank you for your time.
Great. Let's go ahead and collect some responses from the table. Is yours a quick one? Could we have a microphone here? Thank you.
I'm Donna Orwin. I teach at the University of Toronto, and I'm a Russian scholar. My question is is the cultural aspect of this situation. To what extent, I'm an American, I understand what Mike is talking about, and Gary and so on. To what extent is Western Europe ready to become more military? To what extent are boys and girls in these countries willing to serve and fight in conflicts going forward?
Great. Thank you. I think we've got 3 questions that seem along the same lines. The first was regarding unity of the alliance, specifically with Turkey and Hungary. A related question, could we see a weakening of NATO? And this last question, to what extent is Western Europe going to be willing to fight? And then this second question was more focused on Russia and its felt need to expand for territorial security and responding to that. Who would like to go first? Last shall be first.
Which one?
Whichever of the group of 3.
I will take the first one and the last one.
Great.
Is this on?
Yeah.
Yes, about Turkey. Yes, we do have a problem in Southeast. Of course we do. Turkey saw February 24th as an opportunity. As an opportunity to strike a new balance in the Aegean Sea. Turkey is particularly concerned with the relationship between Greece and the United States. Turkey naturally tends to be quite suspicious of the United States, but at the same time, and this was one of the issues in negotiations, frantic negotiations in the last 2-3 days, and probably one of the topics on Joe Biden's conversation with President of Turkey, again, is Turkish access to the defense industrial base of the United States, F-35s and F-16s. And I think Gary and Mike can speak about this. But this relationship between the United States and Greece is profoundly disturbing for Turkey. And once the Greek Prime Minister went to Washington, again, the Americans here, something shifted dramatically in Turkish rhetoric. And again, Turkey is moving away, going back to its past, and its relationship with NATO will be, from my point of view, increasingly tricky to manage. So this is something we have to think about, particularly because of the Black Sea. Going back to your question about culture, yes, I do accept that this is extremely important. And one of the consequences of us moving to this new strategic context is very old questions about national identity, myths, culture will trump economics, and many other things will become as important as economics, finance, and so on and so forth. But because we have decided in many European countries, and perhaps the United States, that history and culture are irrelevant, I think we're not well prepared, intellectually speaking, to address some of these questions. And that's why I think this is going to be difficult, but because we have to integrate into the political discourse all over again these questions. And I think this is going to be hard. So we need to study a lot of history again. So congratulations to the students who are doing political science and international relations. Because again, these disciplines, I'm going to repeat myself, history, poetry, literature, religion, will become very, very important for us to chart a course for the future. This is applied to us, but again, it will apply to Russia too, because Russia's demographics are really not that good. Now, I'm not sure how you can maintain, and to wrap up, Putin never mobilized until now, and there's a reason for that. There's a reason for that. So we have our constraints, yes, but so does he. Again, autocracies also have problems. Thank you.
Bridget, I can take Noah's question if you like.
Let's let Gary chime in, and then we'll turn to you, Mike.
Oh, yeah,
No,
sorry.
go ahead.
On Turkey, I think one should actually think about how quickly Turkey's objections are overcome. We tend to focus on the objections, but it's quite remarkable how the alliance, and particularly backstage, the U.S. and a few others were able to, tell them to shut up and sit down. So, so the good news is, the bad news is Turkey is a problem. The good news is the alliance seemed to be able to handle it quite effectively. Russian insecurity. Let me just turn that around and say the Russian insecurity has more to do less with geography than with the fact that there's liberal democracies on its border. It's a question of that insecurity on the part of Russia that partially drives, maybe clearly close driving Putin's actions. Germany, let me focus on Germany and the culture question. This goes back to the fact that, we had all the allies in Afghanistan. And, we had allies who, like Denmark and the Brits and the French that actually were quite engaged in the military campaigns. Germany notoriously had all the caveats, and so it was a lot less likely to be engaged in the fight. What was interesting to me was that when we did our mini surge of U.S. troops into Afghanistan, one of the things that happened was the 82nd Airborne was put into place in the German north, and the U.S. commander of the troops told the German commander, "We're here under you, so we'll do what you want." And literally overnight, the German caveats disappeared, where they were out patrolling just as much as the U.S. So, it's a mixed bag, but, with a little push and a little leadership, even the Germans are willing to fight, or at least the military is willing to fight. On this question about will Germany and France be a problem in the future, as the Americans expect them to take a bigger role? The answer is yes. The U.S. doesn't have the same kind of dominance in the alliance that it did after the end of the Cold War or at the beginning of the Cold War. And so our ability to manage these relationships are going to be more difficult. That's the reason why I ended up the way I did, which is that it's going to take a president really spending not just a little bit of time on the relationship, but a whole lot of time and effort.
So, Mike.
I thought Noah had a brilliant question. By the way, the students have been great. You've been very, it's great to talk to William Galston and Carl Gershman and Gary Schmidt, but the students, I think you've been very brave in the questions you've asked. I thought Noah's question was very good about this, Russia's habit of expanding, not just when it's surrounded by democracies, but throughout the centuries. And look at it, so it had it in Tsarist Russia, then it had it in the Soviet Union, and then now it has it again with Putin. We can hope that, I think it was Marx, we hope Marx was right at least on one thing, which is that history repeats itself, but the second time as farce. These things end, and they end abruptly. England can live with an independent Ireland, whereas for centuries it believed that it could not. Right here, there has been history, to put it mildly, between Spain and Portugal. And now you're good allies. There's nobody has designs on anybody. That I've seen a face there. None of my Spanish cousins have any designs on Portugal. Let's put it that way. So I think these things end, and I hope that it does end for Russia very quickly, because I think Poland is a wonderful nation, so is Ukraine. They have every right to exist. They're not Russia's backyard. So that's my answer to you, Noah.
Yes, Olivia?
Yeah, so two notes, one optimistic, the other one pessimistic. The first one in relation to Turkey, I totally agree with Gary Schmidt. I think that the good news is that Turkey rapidly decided to let the enlargement continue. And we have to understand that alliances and international organizations are also arenas of negotiations. There's a kind of transitional politics dimension. And Turkey is a major power in the area, in the Black Sea area. It is very sensitive to what's going on there and the war and its relation with Russia and Ukraine. So I think it's quite normal that Turkey needed to show to the other allies its own internal agenda. And in the end, by lifting the veto, Turkey is telling us that it continues to be more important to Turkey to be a member of NATO than to exit NATO, and that's good news. The second note, pessimistic one, is my answer to Mrs. Orwin's comment on the public opinion in Europe. I'm afraid all public surveys show that, in fact, people in Europe continue not to be very convinced that we have to have military power and to pay for that. Especially the younger generation, around 60 to 70% of the younger generation, when asked which they prefer on a situation of war among the United States and China, or the United States or Russia, if they prefer to be on the side of the United States or neutrality, they choose the huge majority neutrality. And this is really, really worrisome, I think. So I'm pessimistic because I think eventually the opinion is going to change, not because there's this mindset evolution, but because of facts and because of reality. And it's going, I think, to be a harsh reality in Europe. It's already starting to be a harsh reality in Europe. Thank you.
Great, we have time for another quick round. Let's start right here in the middle and then we'll move over. Michael in the middle. Yes. Yes, just to the back, and then we'll move across the aisle and then we'll come up to the front.
No.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. My name is Michael Sanfi.
You don't want to hear from me.
And the first, just a quick comment.
Can you speak up?
I can't hear you very well.
Louder.
Can't hear me?
Can you speak
Now.
louder, Michael, please?
stand up.
Just speak.
It's just a quick comment about Turkey, that although Turkey has backed down in terms of this conference and authoritarianism, it does seem like it's confronting the authoritarian challenge, but not in Turkey. Because, you know, Erdogan has a chapter to himself in the latest book by Gideon Rahman, you know, about strongmen. But that's just a comment. My question is really to Mike, if I may. I thought it was very valuable, Mike, that you raised the issue of the Dobbs decision and Roe v. Wade, etc. And I just wonder, doesn't that show that in terms of the values of the alliance, there is actually, you know, there's a limit to the agreement on values. That's a very important issue. And people are quite divided on it. There's been a very strong reaction against that. So, you know, given, and I welcome that you raised the issue, but what's your feeling about how that could, you know, that shows that values aren't really shared across the board. Thank you very much.
Okay, and just across the aisle, we had a question.
Maybe Gary would comment briefly, anybody else if they wanted, on what explains half measures coming from the U.S. On the current war. Is it division, political division? Is it indecision? Is it excessive caution, weak leadership? What accounts for it? Because it's obviously we're not pursuing this as if you know, we want a decisive victory. And the second question to everyone is, and it sort of follows up on Donna's question, has the invasion put an end to Macron's idea of strategic autonomy in Europe? or is that idea going to continue, meaning that Europe should be on its own?
Great. Let's pick up a student question over here on the far end, and then we'll move to the front. I want to make sure we pull in some of the students here.
Hi, hello. All of you touched a little bit on this subject of America basically turning inward. And I would like to know, also related to the last question we had, is if the US, with its great history of isolationism until the last century, if it did turn inward, and if it did abandon NATO, would the alliance become obsolete? As in the sense that would the existing members without the United States, would they still serve the deterrence effect? Thank you.
Great. And then we had a student in the back, and then we'll move to the front. Just in the red in the back. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I would like to address my question to Mr. Mike. You talked about the change in the internal politics in America, in the United States. And I would like to know what will be, if there will be any new demands from the United States to the alliance, and how can Europe respond to that? Thank you.
Military demands, you mean?
No, any demands besides economic effort, of course, which is also a demand.
Okay, great. And then let's move for the last two questions to the front. Mark, Bill, if we could just, if we could just have a quick, yes, these two on the front, yes.
In the interests of time, I will suspend my question, but I will note only that Mike has raised an important issue that we need to discuss further at this meeting, if possible.
Mark.
Yes, the question of cultural agreement is very important. And, you know, what one would have said in the past is that commitment to liberal democracy would supersede the polarization over some of these cultural issues. I wanted to raise a question following up on Gia about Turkey, but also Hungary, which no one really responded to. Someone had said that it was important that NATO be seen as a democratic alliance. Livia, okay. And the question is whether the presence within the alliance of countries, I know there's a long history of this going back to Portugal from the very beginning, but does this become something that creates difficulty for NATO projecting itself as a democratic alliance?
Okay, great. So we've got just about 13 minutes, so I'll ask the panelists to be brief and incorporate a wrap-up comment in your response. I think several questions regarding values and culture and whether this would have an impact on the future of the alliance, whether it in fact might make it obsolete, what new demands might come out of this, and whether the commitment to liberal democracy would supersede our cultural differences, if you could see through to that. Mike, would you like to start off?
Sure, I think I can give an answer. By the way, I said to Bill Galston a couple of days ago that I saw him play golf at the club where I play. And I said, hey, you play better than I do. And he says, that's impossible. I said, I guess you didn't see me play. Look, the question of Michael, the student over there, I would take issue with saying that America has a history of isolation. America begins either in 1776 or when the Pilgrims arrive and with the Mayflower Compact. Some people say it begins in 1619. I don't believe that. But so for at least half of that, America has been engaged with the world. If you start with the Spanish-American War, well, at least with the First World War, I don't think it's an option for us. I don't think, what I said is there's a strand, not a huge strand, but it's a strand within the conservative debate that we have to, but that our problems are so humongous that we need to really focus on them and not so much look overseas. We can walk and chew gum at the same time is what I say. I think we do need to have an important cultural debate while also do these other things. Michael, I think that, look, come and I don't only speak in Cincinnati and Waukesha, I also cross, and I spoke in Madrid and Barcelona and Brussels in the last 4 months, and I met with crowds who say, hey, we need to do what you're doing in America right now. We need to fight. And I said, look, Spain is an ally, but you're very different. We have different, civil society, what's called in Spanish tejido social. So you cannot just replicate what I am doing in Baton Rouge, so I think that there's definitely an echo. There's a parallel here in Europe. In a lot of the debates that I had with my conservative friends, when I was complaining about Macron and Johnson and Schultz saying the things that I think they shouldn't have said, a conservative friend of mine emailed me back and said, Mike, they're just like us. They're Democrats. They're debating things just like we debate things. So I think it still hurts, but I think that we do form the Venn diagram overlap in terms of, I hate to use the word values, but in principles and norms, I think it's huge. I think I will leave it there because I don't want to monopolize the time, Bridget. Give it to somebody else.
Livia, would you have a quick comment?
Yeah, well, I'm only going to say a few things about the questions on Europe. The first one, strategic autonomy. I think there's a problem in Europe, especially on continental Europe, although, well, here in Southern Europe, we're also starting to like a lot of this tendency of using sexy buzzwords and very fashionable concepts like strategic autonomy. When the European Commission started, and European leaders started to mention the need for discuss strategic autonomy Europe, I think no one really knew specifically what strategic autonomy meant. Strategic autonomy in terms of military strategic autonomy, economically strategic autonomy, social strategic autonomy. In the end, I think all of those are part of being autonomous. And the thing is, for Europe to continue to survive and to continue to be a major player in international politics, we do indeed need to be autonomous. And more than autonomous, we need to be resilient. And resilient in military terms, in economic terms, and in social terms. So yeah, okay, this is a concept, everyone is discussing the concept, but at the same time, this is very, very traditional because every major power needs to be autonomous and to be resilient. The second question related to NATO and democracy. For some time, I've also defended that NATO should have a committee on democracy. And then I heard a comment from a public officer who said, another committee at NATO, please. And then I thought, maybe he's right. But the thing is, there's Article 4, right? And member countries have to be continuously engaged in dialogue. And of course, all things related to democracy are fundamental for this specific alliance to work well. So they must continuously discuss all issues, operational issues, requirements associated with the way democracies work and behave on the area of defense and security. For example, Portugal, as you know, was a founding member of NATO, and we were an authoritarian regime back then. When we entered NATO, the first thing NATO asked us was to change our ministries. We had the war ministry, and we had to create a Ministry of Defense. These are two completely different things in terms of political philosophy, right? A war ministry or a defense ministry. And that's already, we continue to be for many, many decades an authoritarian regime, but things were already changing because of these reforms, of these formal reforms. So I think for NATO and for the Euro-Atlantic area and its security, it's important for Turkey and other member states with issues related to the erosion of democracy to continue to participate in the alliance, but it is also important for other member countries to continue to raise these questions, and also in a very formal way, because the way democracies respond to security challenge is in fact fundamental. The message is, might is not right, okay? This is the way NATO thinks. But you also have to understand that sometimes to defend right, you also have to be might, okay? And I think that's the work that NATO has to continue to do with its member countries.
Thank you, Livia. Gary?
Since we're running out of time, I'll not try to answer everything. On the administration's policy towards Ukraine, the issue that Carl raised, I think there's three elements. The first is, I think the political side of the White House was telling the president that being involved in something that's may or may not turn out well is and with the domestic polling numbers what they are, you know, there's a big push to keep Biden out of that sphere while they're dealing with the politics at home. That was compounded by the intelligence community saying, you know, Ukraine wasn't going to win, it might even lose disastrously. So there was momentum building behind that. And then there's Biden himself, who, you know, to show you how old I am, he was the junior senator on the committee when I was the staff director. And he hasn't changed one bit. He makes up his mind, and he's going to stick with it unless he's just bludgeoned out of it. And so, and I could give you lots of examples of that. That said, I think they're underestimating the degree to which the politics of this, if Ukraine does seem to lose or not be successful, it will play back on him. I mean, it's just inevitable. That's just, you're the president of the United States, and so people are going to look to see whether you're successful in this major international crisis. I just wanted to answer at least one student question. On the, you know, if the U.S. was to sort of say, you know, the heck with Europe and you guys are on your own, NATO would fall apart, primarily because there's not a single power in Europe that could conceivably replace the leadership role that the U.S. has to play for NATO to work. And so, you know, Germany is a major power, but it's not significantly more major than France or the UK in terms of military stuff, and Poland is going to be a significant player as well. So it'll just be, you know, it won't be able to sustain itself in the absence of the U.S.
Great comment.
I will adopt William Galston's position, and I will defer to you.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. We'll turn it back to the chairman for the final word of the panel before we break for lunch.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Bridget. Thank you, everybody. Thanks for the questions and for the incredible presentations. I'll just finish. I was browsing the previous Surreal Political Forums panels and titles, and I was looking and I saw that we've discussed this topic in different panels, but we had this topic, the transatlantic relation and NATO, in 2004, 2009, and 2019, yes, in different formats, but we've been discussing this. And I think that given what was discussed here, maybe the next time that we discuss this, we will need to add to the conversation what role, what responsibility are the Europeans willing to play? Because I think that's the issue. And just on what Livia was saying, it is true that Europeans love to discuss these buzz, sexy words, but it's true that last year or a couple of years ago, the discussion in Brussels was whether we should have a strategic autonomy or an open strategic autonomy. And that was supposed to be a difference. So I don't know exactly how this debate will evolve, but I'm sure that we'll have to come back, given that what was discussed here about the relevance of NATO, and now it's Russia, but China will be present and will remain there. And the other thing that I think will help us Europeans is to remember that while we discuss the role that we will have in terms of security and defense and the responsibility that we will have, maybe the decision-making process of NATO will help us to understand how we can organize ourselves. We don't need to form a federation to be able to cooperate in terms of security and defense, but that's just a thought. Thank you very much, and we're on time, absolutely on time, ready to go for lunch. Thank you very much.